The ledger entry read simply, Big Solomon, one night, $500 gold. 9 different hands had signed below it, each belonging to a widow whose husband's fortune still commanded respect across 3 Georgia counties. What those widows paid for in the winter of 1857 would remain Georgia's most carefully guarded secret until a courthouse fire in 1923 exposed documents that should have burned decades earlier. The truth wasn't what anyone expected. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now and type Solomon in the comments, along with where you're watching from. This story has been buried for over 160 years, and the only way we honor these lives is by making sure their truth doesn't disappear again. Share this with someone who needs to understand how power, desire, and resistance created impossible choices under slavery. Now let's go back to where this began. Hancock County, Georgia, 1852. The Waverly Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 287 enslaved people, whose combined auction value exceeded $430,000. Among them stood Solomon, 23 years old, 6 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn sideways through standard door frames. His strength had become plantation legend. He could lift a 600-pound cotton bale alone, pull a stuck wagon from mud that had defeated 4 mules, and work 16-hour days in August heat that felled other men. But Solomon's value to plantation owner Marcus Waverly went far beyond physical labor. In the breeding economy of the Deep South, where enslaved people were commodified assets generating returns through both labor and reproduction, Solomon represented something rarer than strength. He was what traders called prime stock, healthy, intelligent, even-tempered, and possessed of physical attributes that wealthy planters believed would produce valuable offspring. Waverly had purchased Solomon at auction in Savannah for $153 times the average price for an adult male slave, specifically for his breeding potential. The system was coldly calculated. Across the South, enslaved women were forced into sexual relationships designed to produce children who would increase plantation wealth. Some plantations maintained detailed breeding records, tracking bloodlines like livestock pedigrees. Enslaved men deemed genetically valuable were sometimes hired out to other plantations, specifically for breeding purposes, their owners collecting fees that ranged from $50 to $200 per arrangement. The practice was widespread enough that by 1860, the domestic slave trade, fueled partly by breeding, was valued at over $3 billion in modern currency. Solomon's situation, however, took a different turn in the fall of 1856. Marcus Waverly died suddenly of a heart condition at age 52, leaving the plantation to his wife, Catherine, a 41-year-old woman whose social position depended entirely on maintaining the estate's profitability. Catherine faced immediate pressure. Her husband's debts totaled $67,000. Cotton prices had dropped 30% that year, and Georgia law, under the doctrine of coverture, gave her limited legal authority to manage property without male oversight. Her late husband's brother, Judge Thaddeus Waverly, held effective control as estate executor. Judge Waverly proposed a solution that would solve multiple problems: sell Solomon to a breeding consortium being organized by 5 wealthy widows in neighboring counties. These women, all plantation owners in their own right, following their husbands' deaths, had formed an unusual business arrangement. They would collectively purchase high-value enslaved men for breeding purposes, sharing both the cost and the offspring produced. Solomon's price, $3,200, with Catherine Waverly retaining a 15% share of any children born from the arrangement. But Catherine Waverly made a different calculation. In December 1856, she approached Solomon with a proposition that violated every social and legal boundary of the slave South. The conversation, documented years later in Solomon's own testimony to a Freedmen's Bureau agent, went like this. Mrs. Waverly told me she needed money the judge couldn't control. She said certain women would pay gold for one night with me, and if I agreed, she'd put half the money toward purchasing my freedom papers in 5 years. She said I could refuse. But we both knew what refusal meant. I'd be sold to the consortium anyway, with no promise, no timeline, no hope. The arrangement Catherine proposed was this. 9 widows, each operating independently, would pay $500 in gold for one night with Solomon. The total, $4,500, would be split, with $2,250 going to Catherine to pay debts and maintain appearances, and $2,250 held in a secret account toward Solomon's eventual purchase price, which Catherine estimated at $4,000 given his age and strength. The transactions would occur over 18 months, carefully spaced to avoid suspicion, each arranged through a trusted enslaved woman who served as intermediary. The widows themselves represented a specific demographic reality of the antebellum South. By 1860, there were over 50,000 widows in Georgia alone, many controlling substantial estates. Widowhood offered these women a rare form of economic and social autonomy. They could own property, make contracts, and operate businesses in ways married women could not. But that autonomy came with profound isolation. Social conventions prevented them from remarrying quickly or engaging in any behavior that suggested sexual desire. The arrangement with Solomon offered something they couldn't obtain through legal channels: intimacy without social consequence, facilitated by the very power structure that otherwise constrained them. Solomon's choice, if it can be called a choice under slavery, was this: submit to the consortium's breeding program with no agency, no timeline, and no hope of freedom, or participate in Catherine's scheme with the possibility, however uncertain, of purchasing his liberty. He chose the latter. But let's be absolutely clear about what this was. Not consent in any meaningful sense, but the selection of one form of exploitation over another, within a system that offered no good options. Solomon was navigating impossible terrain, using the only leverage available, his own body, to pursue the one thing that mattered: freedom. The first transaction occurred in January 1857. The widow, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, owned 1,200 acres and 83 enslaved people in Putnam County. She was 43 years old, had been widowed for 2 years, and had no children. The arrangement was facilitated by an enslaved woman named Ruth, who managed communications between Catherine Waverly and the widows. Ruth would later testify that Mrs. Pritchard arrived at a predetermined location, a hunting cabin on neutral land between properties, at dusk. Solomon was brought there by Catherine's trusted overseer, a free black man named Jacob Mills, who had purchased his own freedom in 1844 and now occupied an unusual position of limited authority on the Waverly estate. The transaction followed a specific protocol. Mrs. Pritchard handed Jacob Mills a leather pouch containing $500 in gold coins, 25 double eagles, each worth $20. Jacob counted the coins, gave a receipt, and left. Solomon and Mrs. Pritchard were alone until dawn. What happened during those hours was never recorded in detail, but Solomon later told the Freedmen's Bureau agent this: she talked more than anything about her husband, her loneliness, her fear of dying without anyone to remember her. She asked about my life. I told her about my mother, sold away when I was 12. She cried. Before dawn, she said, "I know this is wrong, but I'm so tired of being invisible." 8 more transactions followed over the next 18 months, each with a different widow, each following the same protocol. The widows ranged in age from 37 to 52. Some owned vast estates, others managed modest farms. What they shared was isolation, social constraint, and access to wealth they controlled but couldn't freely enjoy. The amounts they paid, $500 per night, represented substantial sums. In 1857, that was equivalent to a year's salary for a skilled craftsman or the purchase price of a small farm. Catherine Waverley kept meticulous records hidden in a locked box beneath a floorboard in her private study. Those records, discovered after the 1923 courthouse fire, showed every transaction, dates, amounts, initials of the widows, and payments into Solomon's Freedom account. By June 1858, the account held $2,250. Catherine had also been making additional payments from plantation profits, bringing the total to $2,990. Solomon's freedom was becoming financially possible, but the system Solomon was navigating had no intention of letting him go. In July 1858, Judge Thaddeus Waverley began pressuring Catherine to sell Solomon to a consortium of planters in Alabama who were offering $3,800. The judge had discovered irregularities in the estate's finances, money moving in ways he couldn't track, and suspected Catherine of hiding assets. He threatened to petition the court to remove her as estate manager unless she complied with his directives. Catherine faced a choice: expose the secret arrangement and face social destruction, or surrender Solomon and abandon the Freedom Plan. Catherine chose a third option. She approached Solomon with a new proposal: escape. She would provide $200 in cash, enough to reach Canada and establish a new life, along with forged freedom papers identifying him as Samuel Freeman, free man of color, born in Virginia. In exchange, Solomon would leave immediately before the judge could force the sale. Catherine would report him as a runaway, collect insurance money that covered losses from escaped slaves, and use that money to satisfy the judge's demands. Solomon would lose the accumulated freedom fund, but he would gain something more valuable: immediate liberty. Solomon refused. His reasoning, documented in his later testimony, was this: "I had a woman on that plantation. Her name was Dinah. We had a daughter 3 years old named Grace. If I ran, they'd be sold as punishment. Mrs. Waverley promised me that if I stayed, worked the plan, she'd include Dinah and Grace in the freedom purchase. She'd been putting money toward that too. I couldn't leave them." The revelation that Solomon had a family transforms the entire narrative. His participation in the widow arrangement wasn't just about his own freedom. It was about securing liberty for his daughter and the woman he loved. The stakes were exponentially higher, and Catherine Waverley's plan was more complex than it first appeared. She had been secretly negotiating to purchase Dinah and Grace from their legal owner, Judge Thaddeus Waverley himself, who had acquired them in a property settlement 2 years earlier. The judge didn't know Catherine was the buyer. She was using an intermediary, a white merchant in Milledgeville, who owed her a favor. The plan required precision timing. Catherine needed to accumulate $6,200 total, $4,000 for Solomon's freedom, $1,800 for Dinah's, and $400 for Grace's. Children were valued lower. She was $3,100 short. She proposed one final arrangement: 3 more widow transactions at $600 each. She'd raised the price, plus the sale of a section of timberland she owned separately from the estate, which would yield approximately $1,500. The timeline, 8 months. Solomon agreed. 3 more widows paid $600 each between August 1858 and March 1859. The timber sale completed in February 1859. By April 1859, Catherine had $6,140 in the Freedom account. She initiated the purchase transactions through her intermediary. The legal paperwork took 6 weeks to process. On May 28, 1859, Solomon, Dinah, and Grace were legally manumitted. The documents identified them as freed by purchase and granted them permission to remain in Georgia, a requirement under state law that otherwise mandated freed slaves leave within 60 days. But freedom papers didn't guarantee safety. Georgia law required freed black people to register with county authorities. carry papers at all times, and avoid any behavior that could be interpreted as inciting insurrection, a charge that could result in re-enslavement. Solomon, Dinah, and Grace lived under constant threat. They worked as paid laborers on the Waverly estate, where Catherine employed them at rates she carefully documented. $15 per month for Solomon, $8 for Dinah. They saved every penny, planning to leave Georgia once they had enough money to establish themselves in a free state. Then the war came. In April 1861, Georgia seceded from the Union. By 1862, Confederate authorities were conscripting free black men into labor battalions to build fortifications. Solomon faced a choice: submit to conscription, which would separate him from his family and place him back under white control, or flee. In June 1862, Solomon, Dinah, and Grace left Georgia, traveling at night along routes guided by Underground Railroad operatives. They reached Union lines in Tennessee in August 1862. Solomon enlisted in the United States Colored Troops in November 1863, serving in the 44th Regiment. He survived the war, mustered out in October 1865, and returned to Tennessee, where Dinah had been working as a laundress for the Union Army. They had saved $340. They used it to purchase 40 acres of land outside Nashville under the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which granted land to formerly enslaved people and Union veterans. The widows' fates varied. 3 died before the war ended. 2 lost their estates to Union confiscation. 4 survived into Reconstruction, their wealth diminished, but their social positions intact. None ever publicly acknowledged the arrangement with Solomon. The secret remained buried until 1923, when a courthouse fire in Hancock County destroyed the building but exposed a fireproof safe containing Catherine Waverly's hidden documents. A local historian sorting through the charred remains found the ledger with the 9 signatures and the notation, "Big Solomon, one night, $500 gold." The historian, a white man named Thomas Caldwell, initially planned to publish the documents as evidence of moral degeneracy among Southern widows. But when he read Solomon's testimony preserved in Freedmen's Bureau records he cross-referenced, he understood the story differently. He wrote in his private journal, "I thought I had found a scandal. Instead, I found a man who used the only power he had to save his family, and I found women so trapped by their own privilege that they had to buy moments of human connection. The real scandal is the system that made such transactions necessary." Caldwell never published the documents. He donated them to a Black Historical Society in Atlanta, where they remained largely unexamined until the 1990s, when a graduate student researching the economics of slavery stumbled upon them. The student, Dr. Mariah Jenkins, wrote her dissertation on the case, titling it "Intimate Economies: Power, Desire, and Resistance in the Slave South." Her work documented not just Solomon's story, but the stories of 12 other enslaved men who had navigated similar arrangements across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama between 1840 and 1862. Dr. Jenkins's research revealed a hidden pattern: wealthy widows operating in the social and legal margins created by their unusual status sometimes formed covert arrangements with enslaved men, arrangements that existed in a morally complex space between exploitation and mutual need. The men gained pathways to freedom that the legal system denied them. The women gained intimacy that social convention forbade. Both were trapped in a system that commodified human beings and constrained human desire according to race, gender, and class hierarchies. But here's what we must not do: romanticize these arrangements. They were not love stories. They were survival strategies enacted within a system of brutal oppression. Solomon's participation was not freely chosen. It was the least terrible option available to a man who had no good options. The widow's loneliness, however real, does not erase the power imbalance that made the transactions possible. Empathy for their isolation cannot obscure the fact that they were purchasing access to a human being whose legal status as property enabled the arrangement. What Solomon's story reveals is this: resistance under slavery took forms we often don't recognize. It wasn't always dramatic escape or armed rebellion. Sometimes it was a man calculating that he could trade 18 months of exploitation for a lifetime of freedom for his family. Sometimes it was a woman using wealth she didn't earn to subvert a system she benefited from. Sometimes it was an enslaved intermediary like Ruth, who facilitated transactions that gave other enslaved people pathways to liberty while she remained in bondage herself. The moral complexity doesn't reduce to simple categories. Solomon was simultaneously victim and agent, exploited and strategic. The widows were simultaneously oppressors and prisoners of their own social system. Catherine Waverley was simultaneously complicit in slavery and instrumental in Solomon's freedom. The system itself was the true villain, a legal and economic structure that reduced human beings to property, constrained desire according to arbitrary hierarchies, and created situations where the only path to dignity required navigating degradation. Solomon lived until 1891. He and Dinah raised 4 children on their Tennessee farm. Grace, their eldest daughter, became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved children in Nashville's first black school. Solomon's grandchildren included a doctor, a lawyer, and a minister. When Solomon died at age 62, his obituary in the Nashville Clarion described him as a man of uncommon strength and uncommon dignity, who secured freedom for his family through means he never discussed, but which those who knew him understood required a courage most of us will never comprehend. The farm Solomon purchased in 1866 remained in his family until 1967, when his great-great-granddaughter sold it to developers. The sale price was $78,000. She used the money to establish a scholarship fund for black students studying history at Fisk University. The fund is named the Solomon Freeman Scholarship, using the name from his forged freedom papers rather than his slave name. Over 200 students have received support from the fund since 1968. In 2003, the Hancock County Historical Society erected a marker near the site of the Waverly Plantation. The marker reads, "On this land, enslaved people lived, worked, and resisted. Among them was Solomon, who secured freedom for his family through means that testify to both the brutality of slavery and the unbreakable human drive for liberty. Remember that freedom, when denied by law, will be pursued by any means necessary. Remember that dignity, when stripped by systems, will be reclaimed through strategies we may not always understand, but must always honor." The 9 widows have no markers. Their names appear in Dr. Jenkins's dissertation, but their descendants, some of whom still live in Georgia, have requested privacy. One descendant, interviewed anonymously for a 2015 documentary, said this: "My great-great-grandmother did something I can't defend and won't celebrate, but I also won't pretend she wasn't trapped in her own way. The system that enslaved Solomon also imprisoned her in a life where she had wealth but no freedom, status but no power, and loneliness she couldn't escape without violating every rule she'd been taught. I don't excuse what she did, but I understand that oppression creates impossible choices for everyone it touches, even those it seems to privilege." That statement captures something essential. Slavery didn't just brutalize the enslaved, it warped the humanity of everyone it touched. It created a world where a woman's only path to intimacy was purchasing access to a man who couldn't refuse, where a man's only path to freedom was commodifying his own body, where an enslaved woman like Ruth had to facilitate others' liberation while remaining in bondage herself. where a plantation owner like Catherine Waverley could be both Solomon's oppressor and his unlikely ally. The questions Solomon's story raises are these: how do we honor resistance that required moral compromise? How do we acknowledge agency without erasing exploitation? How do we hold space for the full complexity of how people survived systems designed to destroy them? How do we remember stories that don't fit neat categories of hero and villain, victim and oppressor, right and wrong? Here's what I believe. We remember by refusing to simplify. We honor Solomon not by pretending his choices were free, but by acknowledging that he made strategic decisions within impossible constraints and used those decisions to secure freedom for his family. We acknowledge the widows not by excusing their participation in exploitation, but by recognizing that they too were trapped in a system that constrained their humanity, even as they wielded power within it. We recognize Catherine Waverley not as a hero, but as someone who used her privilege in ways that both upheld and undermined the system she benefited from. Most importantly, we remember that the system itself, slavery, with its legal apparatus, economic incentives, and social hierarchies, was the architecture of evil. Individual choices within that system ranged from heroic to monstrous, but the system itself created the conditions where every choice was compromised. Dismantling such systems requires more than individual virtue. It requires collective action to transform the legal, economic, and social structures that make exploitation possible. Solomon's story also reminds us that history is not a simple narrative of progress. We like to believe that we've moved beyond the moral compromises of the past, that we would never participate in systems that commodify human beings or constrain human dignity. But systems of exploitation persist: human trafficking, prison labor, economic structures that trap people in cycles of poverty and debt. The forms change, but the fundamental dynamic remains. People with power making choices that exploit those without power, often while telling themselves they have no choice, or that the system gives them no better options. The question is not whether we would have been different in Solomon's time. The question is whether we're different now. Are we navigating our own impossible systems with the same strategic courage Solomon showed? Are we using whatever privilege we have to create pathways to freedom for others the way Catherine Waverley did, however imperfectly? Are we willing to acknowledge the moral complexity of survival under oppression, or do we demand that resistance look heroic and uncompromised? Solomon's descendants don't celebrate what he did. They celebrate that he survived, that he secured freedom for his family, and that he built a legacy that outlasted the system that tried to destroy him. They understand that honor doesn't require moral purity. It requires acknowledging the full truth of how people navigated systems designed to strip them of humanity, and recognizing that survival itself, under such conditions, is a form of resistance. The scholarship fund that bears Solomon's name has supported students who became teachers, doctors, lawyers, activists, and historians. Some of those students have researched slavery and Reconstruction. Others have worked on contemporary issues of mass incarceration, economic justice, and human rights. All of them carry forward the legacy of a man who understood that freedom, once secured, must be used to expand freedom for others. In 2019, one of the scholarship recipients, a young woman named Ayanna Freeman, no relation to Solomon, but she chose the surname after learning his story, completed her PhD in history at Yale. Her dissertation examined the hidden economies of slavery, focusing on how enslaved people used informal networks, covert transactions, and strategic relationships to accumulate resources and purchase freedom. She documented over 400 cases across the South, where enslaved people bought their own freedom or that of family members, often through means that required navigating morally complex terrain. Dr. Freeman's work challenges the narrative that enslaved people were passive victims waiting for liberation. She shows that they were active agents, constantly strategizing, building networks, and exploiting whatever opportunities the system's contradictions created. Some hired themselves out and saved wages. Some sold goods they produced in their limited free time. Some formed partnerships with free black people or sympathetic whites. And some, like Solomon, used their own bodies as leverage in transactions that gave them pathways to freedom. Her research also documents the costs. Of the 400 cases she studied, 127 involved family separations, people who purchased their own freedom but couldn't afford to purchase their children or spouses. 43 involved people who were re-enslaved after being accused of crimes or failing to maintain their freedom papers. 18 involved people who died before completing the payments required for manumission. The success stories like Solomon's were outnumbered by tragedies, but Dr. Freeman argues that even the tragedies testify to resistance. Every person who tried to buy their freedom, she writes, was asserting their humanity in a system that denied it. Every dollar saved, every negotiation attempted, every risk taken was an act of defiance. We honor them not by pretending their strategies always worked, but by acknowledging that they never stopped trying. That's the legacy of Solomon's story. Not a fairy tale of triumph over adversity, but a testament to the unbreakable human drive for freedom and the moral complexity of pursuing it within systems designed to make it impossible. Solomon made choices we might judge, might not fully understand, might wish he hadn't had to make. But he made them with clear eyes, strategic intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to his family's future. And because he did, his great-great-great-grandchildren live in freedom, carrying forward his name and his legacy. Now, I need you to do something. Go to the comments and answer these questions. If you were in Solomon's position, what would you have done? How do we honor resistance that required moral compromise? What systems today create similar impossible choices? And most importantly, what are you doing to dismantle those systems? Share this story with someone who needs to understand that history is not simple, that survival under oppression requires strategies we might not always comprehend, and that the true measure of a system's evil is not just the suffering it causes, but the impossible choices it forces people to make. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter, if you believe we honor the past by refusing to simplify it, and if you believe the only way to prevent such systems from recurring is to understand them fully in all their brutal complexity. Remember Solomon, remember Dinah and Grace. Remember the 9 widows whose names we know, but whose full stories remain hidden. Remember Ruth, the intermediary who facilitated others' freedom while remaining enslaved herself. Remember Catherine Waverly, who used her privilege in ways that both upheld and undermined the system she benefited from. And remember that every one of them was navigating a system that should never have existed, making choices that should never have been necessary, pursuing dignity in a world designed to strip them of it. Their legacy is this: freedom, once denied, will be pursued by any means necessary. Dignity, once stripped, will be reclaimed through strategies we may not always understand. And humanity, even under the most brutal oppression, will find ways to assert itself, to survive, and to build futures that transcend the systems that tried to destroy it. That's not a simple story, but it's a true one. And truth, however complex, is what we owe the people who came before us and the people who will come after.